Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Duke Football Coverage Podcast, brought to you as always by Bull City Coordinators. You can check us out on our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Follow us on Twitter at DukeFBCoverage. And you can send us an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. Now, why don't we just get right into the meat of what has turned out to be a very slow week in college football. Our next guest is the co-host of the All Sports Discussion podcast, which covers all things ACC related. It is an excellent podcast. They've been kind enough to have me on twice. You can get some very, very informative guests on that, learn a lot about the conference as a whole, as well as what to expect from ACC football teams this season. They were kind enough to have me on last season and this season, and it's been a podcast that I've kept up with since then. And for our next guest, you can follow him at his Twitter account at Talkin' ACC Sports, talking without the G. How are you doing, Jeff?
Hey, doing pretty good. Just trying to take in all this news that happened this week. I know we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, why don't we get into that? Because I think a lot of us thought maybe that the expansion talk and the realignment talk was over, but that's all out of the window with USC and UCLA going to join the Big Ten, which geographically makes zero sense given their location and the Big Ten's location. First off, what are the odds that there's going to be an ACC in existence by the time I get this podcast edited and posted?
I would say the chances of that are 100%.
All right. Well, tell us big picture. Let's talk about big changes that you think might be on the horizon for the ACC.
I mean, the grant of rights agreement that the ACC has ensures the short-term stability of the conference. So, nobody around the conference has to quite panic that something's going to happen in the next 5 years. It's just the cost and the challenges of going after this grant of right just makes it untenable for schools to go after. This agreement is going well into the 2030s. And I think one thing that was a huge difference with what Oklahoma and Texas did and UCLA and USC did is those conferences' rights agreements were coming up in the next 2 to 3 years. And they're not leaving those conferences until those contracts are within a year or when they're over. So if you think that ACC schools are just going to pick up and start leaving here in the next 2 or 3 years, I consider that almost virtually no chance of that happening. What you do have to look for is towards the end of this decade and the beginning of the 2030s. And I know we'll get into it more, but my short version opinion of this is if the ACC stays status quo, doesn't make any significant changes until that time, I don't see the ACC staying together in its current format, into the 2030s. So staying status quo is just not going to work. And they're going to have to make a couple splash moves to ensure its long-term stability. But for the short term, the AD, Jim Phillips, and the schools, they have time to try to make things happen.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because as I was getting ready for this podcast, when I threw kind of what I had intended to talk to you about out the window when we saw the realignment happen, I noticed that the ACC has had a history of expanding. It's kind of been ahead of the curve a lot, bringing in your friends down at Georgia Tech. Florida State, of course, was a seismic shift, particularly for football. And we also saw the way that the ACC started poaching the Big East and brought in Notre Dame to some extent. Given that track record, isn't it possible that the ACC comes out okay?
Yeah, I think there are still a number of factors out there where the ACC could manage to work through this. The first thing was talking about how much longer their television contract remains versus what the Big 12 and Pac-12 we're dealing with. So there are certain scenarios that could ensure its long-term survival. Obviously, Notre Dame is out there. If I'm Jim Phillips, I'm calling them most every every day, engaging their interest in trying to build scenarios, where they would join the conference full. But there's there's other options out there, especially now. I think geography is out the window, academics, alignments are out of the window. This is like about a survival and trying to build your conference. And I mean, I think you have to go really outside the box. I mean, maybe you merge with the remaining Big 12 schools. I mean, there's still a lot of quality brands there. Ohio, Oklahoma State, Baylor football, Kansas basketball. You could even go further west. I don't see there's any reason why you can't, look at the Stanfords and the and the Arizona schools and Washington and Oregon. Um, the other thing that I think that hasn't really been talked about is that it really does seem like there's a split coming with these two mega conferences where Fox is a Big Ten, the Big Ten network basically, and ESPN is SEC. Um, and there's still a lot of brands and a lot of schools out there. And for ESPN, it seems like it would work in their favor to try to keep the ACC intact as long as they can, because right now they still have a fully grown ACC and an SEC. Even with the other diminished conferences, if the ACC breaks up, they're taking a huge risk that who knows if Fox would pick up Florida State and a Clemson, then all of a sudden ESPN becomes really regionalized into a handful of SEC schools. And I don't think you have to worry about the Big Ten doing the AAU thing. They don't care about that. They might say they do, but they're going to take whoever in the end brings biggest value to them. So I think if the ACC were to fall apart, that could potentially hurt ESPN. So I think it's in their best interest they try to do what they can to try to keep the ACC together.
Right. And I don't think it's necessarily Notre Dame or bust for the ACC, although that would help. But if we've learned anything, if you look at what happened to the old Big East, Notre Dame probably isn't your friend when it comes to preserving your conference. But I do think, to follow up on some of the schools that you mentioned, Stanford would be a good fit. Oregon would be a good fit. There's other Pac-12 schools that may be a good fit. The Big 12, though, seems kind of secure to me, like that has stabilized itself some. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it has stabilized to a certain extent, but it's an extremely diminished conference. I saw some things on Twitter where they say, oh, they're the one that could eventually end up being the Power Three. And there's no such thing as a Power Three. That they're a diminished conference without Oklahoma and Texas, as would the ACC be without its biggest brands, or the Pac-12 without its biggest brands. But I think as a conference, I think they are relatively stable with the core members. I mean, some of the other rumors going around is that they could absorb the Pac-12 and prune the new members, which I think anything is possible. I also agree that Notre Dame is not really anyone's friend. They've never looked out for anyone other than themselves. But that also could be that's also something that could work out in the ACC's favor, because Notre Dame has kind of an unusual set of self-interest. They are absolutely not driven by money. They could have joined the Big Ten at any time in the last 10 or 15 years and just dwarfed what they made as a solo school. So, I mean, for them, they could want that recruiting presence in the South, still playing the programs in the South. They have a much better alignment with the Northeast schools, even though I know the Big Ten now has a couple schools in that region, but they have a lot more aligned with the East Coast private schools. So, I mean, Notre Dame's self-interest I don't think they don't lie with money. They lie with whatever they have going on in there. So um, I think it's definitely on the table that Notre Dame could join the ACC. But like you said, I don't think it's quite Notre Dame or bust. But the ACC definitely has to make some kind of major move.
And you wonder, I've read some stuff about how Clemson may leave and go to the SEC. I don't believe that. I think Clemson's in a good spot. I've also read that Florida State and Miami may want to pick up and leave, which I get for financial reasons. They may want to do that. But if I'm the SEC, I'm not really sure how much outside of Clemson those two programs add right now. And then I've also seen that the Big Ten may come after Duke and North Carolina. I know this is all wild speculation and rumors, but as far as any ACC teams leaving, again, let's not count Notre Dame because they're not an ACC school really.
Right.
Which ones do you think are likely targets?
I think, I think Clemson is still a football target, but I don't think it's quite the slam dunk, Oklahoma and Texas are, because even at that time, that was still opening up the SEC to the rest of Texas and to that large brand that Texas has. I mean, Clemson has definitely elevated itself over the last, 7 or 8 years, but they're still not Texas. And arguably, they're really not Oklahoma with that gigantic fan base. And neither is Florida State. I mean, I think of these 4 teams that have all made moves, I think you could argue that none of them are quite the brand that any of the 4 were, save UCLA at this point. I mean, I think you could argue USC has a bigger national brand and the LA market. That's something that Florida State and Clemson can't quite offer because they're already in SEC regions. So I don't quite think it's a slam dunk, but if a couple of ACC schools were to move, they probably would be Clemson in the SEC, Florida State, in the SEC, Miami. I think they're kind of a wild card. I think schools like Miami, NC State, and Virginia Tech are wild cards because I think they could be valuable properties for these other conferences, but they're not necessarily assured because they're already doing these evaluations with Oregon and Washington and in the Big Ten. And if these schools don't add, the requisite boost in the TV contract, it's just adding another mouth to feed. And I think right now only Clemson and probably Florida State are the only 2 that can really say that would happen in football. I think North Carolina and Duke with their basketball, but I mean, you see what's happening to Kansas. They didn't get picked up. It's really hard to say outside of Clemson and Florida State if all the rest of them would be assured of finding a home. I could see I could see it being as few as 4 ACC teams moving and as many as 10. What these conferences, the Big Ten and SEC, look for is just now you're getting into schools that aren't the hugest national brands. But yeah, probably Clemson and Florida State are probably the 2 best positioned because of their history, location, and football.
Frankly, if Clemson leaves, I don't see how the ACC could possibly survive. By far, that is the best football brand in the conference. Again, not counting Notre Dame, who I don't count as a member.
Right.
But I just don't see how in the world the ACC could possibly survive if Clemson leaves.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, just like the Pac-12 really can't survive as a full conference without USC and UCLA. The same went for the Big 12 in Texas and Oklahoma. If the ACC were to lose Clemson and Florida State, they would definitely be relegated to a more group of 5 conference than anything resembling a power conference.
At some point, should we start considering, or the conferences start considering different basketball and football alignments, because none of this is going to be good, and it hasn't been particularly good for basketball.
Yeah, I think that's the eventuality of it. I mean, right now they are, you're talking about the two mega conferences, and if they expand to 20 or 24 teams dominated by football brands, there's also a significant number of schools in those conferences that are not football brands at all and not good at football uh, in any way. I think two things could happen when you have a two-team race. There's someone who's first and there's someone who's last, and eventually one of them is going to pull ahead of the other. And if I'm Ohio State and I'm trailing Alabama, or I'm Alabama trailing Ohio State, I'm looking at the other one saying, hey, why are they making $15 million more a year than me? And then eventually you start looking at either joining up with that other conference, or you just split off your football. And like you said, I don't think the end game is just going to be 224 team Big Ten SEC. I think you're either going to see the football schools truly split off eventually, or you're going to see those conferences start to prune their lesser brands. I mean, what as good as Vanderbilt is in baseball and potentially in basketball, they don't bring anything to the SEC in football. And if you need more money, if you want to create more revenue for the schools generating the money, eventually you start pruning teams. And I think that could also happen too. So I don't think the two-team mega conference is the final end game of this by any stretch. I think eventually you're going to have about 24 to 32 football brands split off completely, and then what remains are going to be the Olympic sports conference.
And final thought on this, and we'll get into some more ACC specific stuff, is going back to what you said about the Big 12. Once Texas A&M, or excuse me, once Oklahoma and Texas leave, you do have to wonder if schools like Baylor, schools like BYU are going to want to come in there, stick around, with the context of Big Ten is starting to grab people, Pac-12 is starting to fall apart. What are we going to do? Are schools like, are conferences like the ACC going to try to make a move, or is the Pac-12 going to make a move to try to grab some of these? And while the Big 12 is looking good right now coming through it, that conference only has 12 teams. They're behind. They're going to have to make a move. So the Big 12 is on the Pac-12 is on the ropes. It's going to be falling apart. And to your point, if the ACC wants to stay relevant, if the Big 12 wants to stay relevant, they're going to have to start doing things. And what we've learned from the prior rounds of realignment is anything goes and it's crazy. So, God only knows what'll happen with all this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's still an opportunity to have like 4 major conferences. And I think in some way the Big 12 and the Pac-12 have to combine. I think a couple things have to happen. If Notre Dame joins the ACC and the ACC picks up another school or two, and the Pac-12 and Big 12 merge, or if there's some kind of merger between the three, there's too many football brands and quality schools that even the Big Ten and SEC can't leave them out, and you would still have some semblance of the collegiate model that we've seen in the past. But if the ACC doesn't survive, the Big 12 and, like you said, the Pac-12, if they splinter even more, then it becomes this free-for-all. And like I said, I don't see the end game just being those two conferences. In another 10 years, they'll start poaching each other, or they'll either start poaching each other, pruning inside their own house, or their football brands are going to separate from their own conferences and just keep their Olympic sports. So I don't see in any way that just an SEC Big Ten is the final look of this for the next 30 years. Not at all.
No, I don't think so either. But I do think that the Pac-12 is going to have to get aggressive. Maybe they
Yes.
align with the Big 12. That's helpful. But then that leaves the ACC out. And other than Notre Dame, I'm not really sure what school the ACC looks at. So
I think if Notre Dame did join, then most anyone else the ACC looked at, could join as long as Notre Dame did. But I think the most likely candidate would probably be West Virginia, because I mean, if you're what of the remaining schools, they still have a pretty good basketball brand, pretty good football brand. I think the most likely scenario, I mean, not necessarily the likely scenario, but if Notre Dame did decide to join, I do think West Virginia would probably be the top candidate to join them.
And it may be a good idea to look at Stanford as well and pair
Yes,
it with another Pac-12 school to make traveling a little bit easier. But hey, then
certainly.
it's just the Coast Conference at that point. You can take out the Atlantic.
Yeah,
You're just the Coast. So you got your
exactly.
branding. You're kind of doing like this, share or Prince type of a thing, right, with your name. So it's coming along. While we still have an ACC, let's talk about the 3-5-5 schedule announcement, what that means and how it's going to work. So how is that going to work once the divisions go away for a couple of years?
Yeah, so you'll have each ACC team will have 3 permanent opponents they play over the next few years. And then you'll rotate 5 teams on, 5 off. The 2 best teams in the conference will play each other for the ACC championship at the end of the year. And then in the course of 4 years, every ACC school will play on the road and host the rest of the ACC schools. So it's a long overdue model. And, prior to the news of UCLA and USC, I thought that was, a very much needed move that kind of enhanced ACC football. It's still a good move. I definitely, like we were talking earlier, the ACC is going to be here for at least the next 5 years for us to enjoy that. But yeah, the 3-3-5 or the new model has been something that we've waited for a long time, and I'm glad they finally made it happen.
I think that the tiebreakers could be pretty interesting. And as far as the benefits, and we can get into some of the setups that we do like, some of the ones we don't. For example, I like the Duke setup playing North Carolina State and Wake Forest because that will help Duke's attendance.
Right.
In adding NC State. And it'll also hopefully get away from some of the issues that we've seen with unbalanced divisions and a weak coastal team getting in and 2 really good Atlantic teams maybe should be playing each other for the championship. So I think that's a good thing. What about downsides? What are some of the downsides that you see from this?
I don't really see any major downsides. This was absolutely a necessary thing to do, and it's so much better than the previous model that I don't see anything that I felt like was a major downside. A couple minor things, losing the Wake Forest NC State series after all these decades of them playing each other, I think was a little bit of a loss. Virginia Tech and Miami no longer going to meet on a yearly basis was a little bit of a loss. But even in these cases, they're not going to go 6 or 7 years without playing or playing in each other's stadiums. I mean, they're still going to play twice within a 4-year period. So I don't think you lose that much, and you gain so much from a scheduling attendance standpoint. Like you said, they really did a good job of scheduling a lot of games between Duke, North Carolina, NC State, and Wake Forest. They couldn't, build the perfect 4-team round robin there, but they got them playing each other quite a bit, and that's going to be great for those schools for regional interest, possibly even national interest if they're doing really well, but in attendance at those games, Georgia Tech and Florida State won't be playing, and Atlanta is Florida State's closest um, opposing location. So a couple things like that, kind of say, well, I wish it could have been a little better, but overall, I don't see any major downsides to what they've done.
Here are the pairings that I'm not a fan of, and I may miss one. I think Wake Forest did not get a great one other than playing Duke every year, which I like. That's all usually a good game, except for the last couple of seasons. But Wake playing Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech every year, I don't think really adds a whole lot there. Also, going through it again, Florida State having to play Syracuse every year. I like the Clemson and the Miami. I think you could have found them another team that would have been better than that. And then what are your thoughts on Georgia Tech getting Clemson, Louisville, and Wake every year?
I think in the short term, they've showed the stats that Georgia Tech has the highest opponent winning percentage in their primary opponents over the last 3 or 4 years. So you can say, oh, well, Georgia Tech definitely got a rough draw at this. But on the other hand, under Jeff Collins, their program is in such a state that I don't know if you could have put 3 teams, any primary opponents, where they would be favored in more than one of them. I mean, right now they're pretty much staring up at the entire conference, and they just need to get better. I mean, Clemson is one thing, but they really should be no reason that they go into games with Louisville and Wake Forest probably being 7 to 14 point underdogs year in and year out. They just need to get better. I mean, I think under the right coach and under the right leadership, Georgia Tech should definitely be able to compete with Louisville and Wake Forest on a yearly basis.
All right. So that's going to last, I think, for a total of 3 seasons. And then after that, it's up in the air and they may revise it some. I believe it's going to end in 2026, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
So they'll probably tweak it some every year. But I think on the whole, you can complain like I have about a couple of lineups or matchups here and there. I think on the whole, though, it's good. And I think it should hopefully produce a more balanced, more fair conference year in and year out. But while we still have it, you're a fan of a coastal team. This is obviously a Duke football themed podcast. So let's talk about the Coastal. What are you looking for from that division this season?
I think you look at the Atlantic, and from top to bottom, the Atlantic is probably better than the Coastal, with Clemson, NC State, who I think NC State is going to be really good, and Wake Forest also going to be really good. So I don't think the Coastal, quite has the depth of what you'll see in the Atlantic division. But I think you definitely have the potential to see a couple of teams that could, definitely be top 15, top 20 caliber. And right now I'm looking at Pitt, even with Jordan Addison going to USC and Miami as the 2 preseason favorites. I mean, Pitt still brings back a ton to that team. They've got a lot of talent. They have the transfer quarterback from USC, Slovis. They've got a lot of players returning on defense. They've got some talented players on offense, and they're starting to get to the point where, they're not the inconsistent Pitt. I mean, they're taking care of more games than they have in the past. I know last year they still had the upset loss to Western Michigan after beating Tennessee. But overall, they're a lot more consistent than they had been, where they would win one great game and then lose. It seemed in alternating weeks lose to someone they shouldn't. So I'm definitely looking at Pittsburgh, and then Miami with Van Dyke there at quarterback. Some people call him the best prospect at quarterback in the ACC, and the ACC is loaded at quarterback. There's no question about that. Cristobal, the new coach at Miami, has put together an outstanding staff. And every year it seems like, oh, this could be Miami's year. And then again, we're looking at it like, oh, maybe the pieces are in place for them to be a really major factor in the ACC. But I do think there are definitely pieces in there where they could be the coastal representative in Charlotte. But right now, I look at those two as kind of being the favorites. Virginia, it's a little bit of a wild card because with Brennan Armstrong, they also have themselves an outstanding quarterback. They have some really good weapons at wide receiver. Some have called, with Dontavian Wicks out there. Let me make sure I just got it. Yeah, Dontavian Wicks and some of that receiving core. I mean, they should be really outstanding on offense, even if they have to kind of show where the running game is going to come from. But it's defensively where you wonder where Virginia is at. I mean, they can score on anyone with Armstrong, but will they be able to stop anyone? So if they get some of their defense together under new coach Tony Elliott, I mean, they could be a factor. I would not discount Virginia. After that, I know North Carolina has Josh Downs. They've recruited decently, but no more Howell at quarterback. Last year was North Carolina's shot, and they kind of missed it. I don't see, I see them being a bowl type team. Potentially maybe winning 8 with a ceiling of 9 wins, but I don't think they have enough there at North Carolina to win the Coastal Division. Same with Virginia Tech, just too many question marks at Virginia Tech. I mean, they've got themselves a new coach going into the season with Brent Pry, and so they're not going to fall off the face of the map or anything. I think they'll field a competitive football team, but just too many question marks at Virginia Tech, I think, to be one of the favorites. And then the two schools that we follow the most, Duke and Georgia Tech. It's hard to see a scenario where they are really factors in the Coastal Division. With Cutcliffe leaving Duke, they got Elko out of Texas A&M. If I'm not mistaken. And I think that was a great move for Duke. He had a really good pedigree. But I just don't think, and you can definitely speak more on this than me, I just don't think there's a lot of talent across the board for Duke to make much of an upward movement. But I think they'll be like a fundamentally sound team who's maybe capable of an upset or two. With Georgia Tech, they lost their best player on their team to Alabama in Jahmyr Gibbs. But they do return some decent talent at running back. They got Hassan Hall from Louisville, and Dante Smith is a quality running back. Jeff Sims is definitely a talented quarterback, athletic, talented. His decision making has been questioned, and if he can overcome that hurdle with his decision making, I mean, I think offensively Georgia Tech can do some things, but it'll be on the defensive side of the ball where it's hard to see, them taking too many leaps forward on the defensive side of the ball. So, they might be able to pull an upset or two like they did against North Carolina, but hard to see Duke or Georgia Tech being bowl teams at all, especially with Georgia Tech's schedule. And they massively overscheduled beyond their capabilities. I mean, they're playing Ole Miss, UCF. They always have Georgia and Clemson. And in those first few weeks, this is the start of their schedule. They play Clemson, then they get the Western Carolina game. Let me just make sure that I'm remembering that right.
Yeah, you've got Clemson, Western Carolina, Ole Miss, UCF, Pitt, Duke, Virginia, Florida State, Virginia Tech, Miami, North Carolina, and Georgia. That is a brutal schedule.
Yeah, right out of the gate, you're looking at a 1-win start through the Pitt game, because there'll be considerable underdogs in all of those games. And at that point, then Jeff Collins, who probably should have been fired at the end of last year, is definitely getting that resume updated at that point. with that kind of start. So they could actually be better than they were last year. And I think same with Duke, they could actually be better teams than last year, and the records might not really reflect it. And it's just because the rest of the ACC has improved too. And you can look at the quarterbacks there in the Coastal Division, with Van Dyke, with Armstrong. I mean, there's just a lot of ground that they have to make up to win more than 3 or 4 games.
It's not going to be that hard for Duke to be a lot better than it was last year. And it's the same thing for Georgia Tech. But I do think translating it into wins and losses is going to be difficult unless you see teams like Pitt, Wake, and others regress or fail to improve. Virginia could be another one. But I'm hopeful Duke will be competitive. I'd love to see them go 6-6 and get to a bowl game. It may be difficult, but you could see this both with Georgia Tech and Duke is the wins aren't there, but the optimism is there because of the improved method of play and the competitiveness. So I'm hopeful, but just to recap, I think we kind of agree for the Coastal, Pitt and Miami are the top of the class. UVA, depending on how things develop with the new staff, is after that. And I know you said UNC's recruited well, but they've done that for 4 years now, and they haven't had a whole lot to show for it. I don't know why we should think this year will be different. And so my view on North Carolina is I will believe you can do it when you show me you can do it.
Yeah, that's definitely fair.
Yeah. Coaching changes. A lot were made last season. Other than probably Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, do you think any coaching changes would be likely going into next season?
I mean, I think Dino Babers at Syracuse. I mean, Jeff Collins has definitely been like the high profile. Okay, this guy's going to be finished by the end of the year without a big season, but I think a lot has been masked at Syracuse from that 10-win season they had a couple of years back. If you look at what Dino Babers has done on the whole, they've been kind of masked by that season, and also an early upset victory over Clemson early in his tenure there. But Syracuse, I mean, you look at his record the entire time, but that 10-win season, and they've been, it's been pretty mediocre. I think he's a good football coach, but they just don't have the players up there at Syracuse. I mean, they have the running back Tucker, who's been so outstanding, but it's just not translating into a lot of wins. I mean, 2 years ago during the COVID year, they were a 1-win team. Last year, they still missed a bowl. I mean, I think this is kind of a make or break year for Dino Babers as well, and he's probably the one that's next on the list. Scott Satterfield at Louisville is not the most popular coach there right now. I think Louisville fans are very frustrated with Satterfield. He's fallen way behind the rest of the Atlantic Division. I mean, Clemson is obviously there, but NC State and Wake Forest have blown past Louisville. You can argue Boston College is maybe past them as well, or at least in the same ballpark, and eventually Florida State will find it. So, you've fallen behind in the Atlantic. Your in-state rival Kentucky is blowing you away on the field. So even though Louisville has recruited this year, right now they're recruiting extremely well. They've pulled in a couple surprise recruits that have kind of like stunned everybody who they've landed. I think they just picked up a top 5 running back in the last couple of weeks. But I mean, that's not going to save Satterfield if he has a really bad season. Now, what that might get you by is if you win, 7 or 8 games, make a bowl game, that might, tip the scales in your favor to hold on to you. But I mean, if they struggle, have a 4 or 5 win season, they may not continue with Satterfield there either. So, after Jeff Collins, I think you definitely have to look at Dino Babers and Scott Satterfield, even Mac Brown a little bit at North Carolina. It's like you said, they've recruited well, but they haven't really, taken it to the level many expect. I mean, you might start to hear a few, whispers in the background about his status if North Carolina really struggles this year.
I think that the possibility of this being Mac Brown's last season is high, just because I think the fan base is going to be tired of those 7-5, 6-6 win seasons. And if the program stays kind of where it is now, stuck in neutral, they're going to mutually agree to separate like Cutcliffe and Duke did. I also think Mike Norvell could be on the chopping block if they have a bad season or they just fail to progress. He didn't inherit a great situation. They do seem to be moving in the right direction, but he's one that I think could be in some trouble. Not that we're rooting for anybody to lose their jobs. So any other coaches out there, or I think we pretty much got it covered, is who may be getting their resume together.
No, I think you pretty much nailed it there, and glad that you mentioned Norvell too, because last year, halfway through Florida State season, they were ready to run him out of Tallahassee, especially after that debacle of a loss against Jacksonville State. But as much as that game sent the season sideways in the first half, I mean, this year he's got LSU in the second game of the season, and if he were to win that game, I mean, all of a sudden, they love him again. So Norvell is definitely teetering where it can go one way or the other, where some of the guys like Babers and Jeff Collins, it's not teetering for them. They're on the hot seat going into the season and need fast starts. But I like what Florida State is putting together. They did play better in the second half of the season. They got the win over Miami. They were right there in that game against Florida. Maybe even should have won that game. So we'll know early on with Florida State, where Norvell has them, because that LSU team under their new coach Brian Kelly, I mean, it's not the Joe Burrow LSU team of their national championship team. I mean, they're kind of a mid-level SEC team, which look like a lot of mid-level SEC teams. There's some talent. They've got athletes, but if you're going to be a good football team, they're the kind of team that you should be able to beat. So we'll know early on where Florida State is.
And Florida State does have a difficult schedule. You got Duquesne, but then LSU, Louisville, which could be a good team. Boston College is not going to be an easy win. Wake Forest, if Wake plays the way that Wake played last year, that's going to be tough. NC State, I know I've already said in a different interview that this is a classic NC State collapse type season. Then you got Clemson. That's a brutal 3-game stretch. Then you got Georgia Tech. And if Miami is up, that's going to be a difficult one. Then you got Syracuse, Louisiana, and Florida. It's not going to be an easy road for Florida State. And that fan base is not necessarily known for its patience. So we'll see what happens with them. But anything else that you'd like to talk about regarding, I guess, any topic? I give everybody an open mic. You guys you're kind enough to take some time to come on. So I want to give you a chance to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a quick thought on the Atlantic Division. I mean, I think, this is one of the sneaky better conferences in the country. It definitely is not stopping and starting with Clemson this year. You mentioned NC State. I mean, it could be out there that they don't, achieve what many people expect, and that's to be a quality team. But I mean, they've got the pieces in there to be a really good football team. I mean, they got experienced quarterback with Devin Leary. They've got one of the 5 best linebacking units in the country. Peyton Wilson, if he's healthy, and Drake Thomas, and Moore is also a really good linebacker. I mean, they've got talent on that team on both sides of the ball, and that's why I think they might have an opportunity not to have the collapse that we've seen in the past, is because of how good they're on both sides of the ball. Like North Carolina last year was still a very good offensive team, but fell apart on the other side, on the defensive side. And I think North Carolina State is a more balanced team than UNC was last year. But I mean, they got to prove it on the field. And one thing that Doran has to do is that they can't lose these out of conference games that they keep finding ways to lose. I mean, Doran still doesn't have a signature victory out of conference. They got the win over Clemson, and that's definitely outstanding. But I mean, they had an opportunity last year with high expectations and go into Starkville, play Mississippi State, who was a really mediocre football team, and just got thumped in that game. And you know, that's the kind of game that North Carolina has to. They have to win those type of games, you know, out of conference, you know, if they really want to elevate their program. And this year, you know, that game for them is Texas Tech, and they're better than Texas Tech, and that's a game they absolutely cannot afford to lose. And you know, East Carolina is a tricky opener. They're always a tricky opener. But if you get through those games and you're 4-0 going to Clemson and setting up probably one of the games of the year in the ACC. So I'm looking there at Clemson, NC State, and then Wake Forest. With as good as they are offensively under Dave Clawson, I don't think in the end they'll have enough to stay with Clemson and NC State over the course of the season. But I mean, he's now built the program to where 9-10 wins isn't just a great season. It's starting to get to be the expectation at Wake Forest, and they're going to really be a tough out. And a last word on Clemson, their defense. I mean, it's rivaling what they had in 2018. When you look at what they have in their front seven and that defensive line, I mean, this might be. No, I don't say this might be, but I don't think you'll see a better defensive line in all of college football. I mean, they've got 4 guys who could be first and second rounders, and on their 2 deep, they've got more NFL caliber linemen. I mean, if Clemson can get their quarterback position right under DJ Uiagalelei, or if the Klubnik kid takes over, Cade Klubnik at some point, I mean, if they just get slightly above average quarterback play, I mean, they can make it to the playoff and compete for a national title. The problem was last year they were so bad on offense, especially through around mid-October. They were so bad on offense that they basically just had to shut out teams to win. But if they can just get even average to slightly above average quarterback play, I mean, they could find themselves in the playoff again, because their defense is going to be so good this year.
It tells you how good that program has been when 10 wins is considered a down year. I think a lot of schools would gladly take that down year in a heartbeat. But putting that aside, it should be an interesting ACC season coming up. Jeff, I appreciate you coming on. For all the listeners out there, we have one more interview guaranteed. My July was supposed to be pretty brutal, but I've had a trial that was going to go the first week of August get continued. So now I have some additional time I can devote to maybe throwing on another interview or 2 before we get to the season preview in August. So stay tuned. I will keep you guys updated, see what I can get locked down. In the interim, check us out at our website, bullcitycoordinators.com. Listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, and send me a message, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Our DMs at Duke FB coverage are open, and go Duke.